Go ahead.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very grateful to the Center and to Steve for producing this report, partly because I came to this issue initially as an opinion journalist, someone who's trying to seek out information about very basic questions. For example, when we talk about the incidence of hunger in the United States, to what extent does this relate to the foreign-born population? Seems like a very simple, very basic question. It's in fact extraordinarily difficult to get a straight answer on that question. Recently, Catherine Eden, a celebrated sociologist, has co-authored a new book with collaborator Luke Schaefer on $2 a day poverty in the United States. Basically, the number of Americans who are living below a global poverty standard. Now, there are a number of issues with this book. For example, she's relying on self-reported surveys. She's relying on income reporting, which is different from consumption reporting. Lots of issues, but it's an extraordinary look at millions of American families living on very, very low incomes. Now, what's striking about the book is that there is no treatment of immigration in the book at all. In fact, the word immigration or immigrant comes up, I believe, on 2 or 3 occasions, talking purely about the 1996 welfare reform legislation. But really, she's talking about people in the Mississippi River Delta. She's offering an ethnographic account of populations that are part of the entrenched multi-generational poor in this country. But of course, those are not the only people who are extraordinarily poor in this country. It's this incredible mystery. And this is the kind of basic data that you'd think that we would be getting from public agencies, but it has to be independent researchers who are producing this report. And we can all speculate as to exactly why that is, but I think that it's very telling that you haven't seen people question the basics of the data that Stephen has presented. I think there's a reason for that. And I also think that the federal government should have an obligation to report this kind of data in a more reliable and systematic way. So again, on one level, I just come at this purely as a journalist. Most of the people that I know are either first or second generation Americans. I grew up in New York City. That's where I live right now. It's a heavily immigrant community. And there are a lot of extraordinary basic questions about living in a place like New York. For example, the availability of market rate private housing for someone who is a middle income professional, it's challenging. It's a very expensive place to live. How exactly are immigrants managing to make it? Well, part of it is large-scale violation of housing and zoning laws. Now, this is not because, again, these immigrants are bad people. It's because their market incomes are extraordinarily low. Over the last year and a half, we've had a spate of stories about the so-called contingent workforce. Many of these stories have been around the idea of Uber drivers who are working in a very contingent way. Why would anyone want to do this kind of contingent work? The simple answer, if you talk to anyone, and this is particularly true in New York, is that your other labor market opportunities are in fact far worse than working in this contingent fashion. And actually, people are extraordinarily grateful for these job opportunities. So to the kind of middle and upper middle income journalists who are kind of shocked and horrified by what's happening, by the fact that people are engaging, entering this kind of contingent work voluntarily, I think that's something that they really need to think about. How much do you actually know about the labor market opportunities offered to people not only with limited skills, but also with limited social networks? Similarly, the New York Times published a harrowing, fascinating story this year about nail salons by a reporter, Sarah Maslin-Neer. And basically what she found in this story is that there's a large number of less skilled immigrants, many of whom are from East Asia, who are working for sub-minimum wages in nail salons, where they're oftentimes subject to dangerous and illegal labor practices. Now, the trouble with this article was extremely illuminating, extremely helpful, but the trouble with this article is that, again, this is the best labor market opportunity these women have identified. Were there another more attractive labor market opportunity, they would presumably be working that job rather than this job. It's a very, very basic point that people refuse to reckon with. And I frankly find it baffling. So then the solution is that Governor Cuomo will appoint a task force. He will shut down a few nail salons or whatever else, or launch a series of new investigations. But again, does that mean that if I'm an employer, I'm necessarily going to start paying these women, let's say, the equivalent of $15 an hour? And again, keep in mind that for a very wide swath of Americans, we have decided that it is unethical for employers to pay workers less than a living wage, defined at somewhere between $12 and $15 an hour. Now, I don't know how many of you guys had summer jobs at a certain point earlier in life or whatever else, or how many of you have run small businesses of your own. But a $15 wage is oftentimes a wage that someone works up to as they acquire experience, as they acquire various non-cognitive skills that allow them to become productive contributors in a workplace. And to some extent, you have people who are earning, let's say, a training wage, where there's kind of less risk and whatever else, you're taking on these employers. But, again, we are collectively deciding as a society that this is unacceptable. And I think that, the National Employment Law Project had a fascinating study where they were accusing low-wage employers of basically making use of subsidies like the EITC to kind of subsidize their low-wage workforce. Now, the conceptual problem with this is that you could say that poverty is a broader American problem and that taxpayers have to mitigate the poverty problem. That's not solely the responsibility of employers to go about doing that. When we're talking about immigration, however, and particularly when we're talking about employers who are agitating for immigration laws that allow them for a larger low-wage workforce, we're dealing with a very different situation. When you're talking about, for example, employers in agribusiness who are saying that the only way they can make their agricultural operations work is with a very low-wage workforce, there are a couple of things we forget. One of which is that actually this kind of agricultural work, like working in a nail salon, is actually extremely physically strenuous work. When people say that we cannot lower the Social Security, we cannot increase the Social Security retirement age because some people do back-breaking work, some of the people they have in mind are people doing this intricate work with their hands. Now, if an agribusiness can't afford to pay someone a reasonable wage right now, surely they cannot also afford to deal with a lifetime of pain that is caused by doing this kind of work. Surely it is reasonable to suggest to agricultural employers that we might want to invest in more capital-intensive solutions, given that actually all of society is bearing the costs of this physical pain endured by these women and men, some of whom are very young, some of whom are incapable of working by the time they enter their late 40s and 50s. And again, this is not because they are bad people. This is not because they are not willing to work. This is simply because certain kinds of back-breaking work are simply incompatible with a society like our own and the kind of social expectations that we've developed. Now, there are many fascinating aspects of this report, but I would argue that in some respects it actually, and I think Robert alluded to this, in some respects it actually underestimates the scale of the problem, and why is that? So when we're looking at the welfare state at the federal level, or when we're looking at a problem like, when we're looking at a program, I should say, like Medicaid, you're looking at essentially cutting checks. You are cutting checks to medical providers, let's say, for offering a given medical service. You are cutting checks directly to individuals to kind of help them have a higher income despite having a very low market wage. But actually, many of the services required by people who are part of the entrenched multi-generational poor, and particularly many of the services required by their children, are labor-intensive services. That is to say, it could be that if my parents are illiterate or they do not speak fluent English, I might need more personal attention when I'm attending a public school than someone else. I might need a lower teacher-student ratio in my class. I might need social workers. I might need a whole suite of services to have any hope of actually closing some of those deficits I'm experiencing in my household. The trouble is that labor-intensive services in a high-productivity, high-wage society are more expensive than they are in a low-productivity, low-wage society. This is a phenomenon known as Balmer's cost disease. It is very close to an iron law of economic life and economic development. Now, if you look at Norway, this is a country where the Norwegians have had a very open debate about immigration, particularly vis-a-vis refugees and asylees. And one thing that they've determined is that, again, Norway is a very high-cost, very affluent society, but they've determined that to provide for one single Syrian refugee in their country, it would cost almost $100,000 in services. Now, let's stipulate that that's going to be higher than it would be in the United States because there's a far more generous suite of services. They also determined that provide for the basic needs of that same refugee in Jordan, they can provide for not only that refugee, but for 25 of them. One of the extraordinary things we're looking at is this kind of cosmopolitan argument for immigration, that we have an obligation through the lens of global redistribution to kind of meet the basic needs of very poor people around the world. And I'm willing to concede that there may well be some truth to that. But given that meeting the needs of these people and giving them a fighting chance to become part of the middle class is so extraordinarily expensive there, and given that the cost of living is also meaningfully less expensive in, let's say, a middle-income country like Mexico, you're dealing with a situation where there's this deep illogic. Sweden is going through a period right now where they're actually cutting their overseas development assistance budget to increase the spending on refugees and asylees in their native country. Now, keep in mind that the aid budget is helping a much larger number of people in gross terms than the refugee budget. So I think that when we're thinking about that, even from that perspective of global redistribution, there's a certain confusion underlying this logic. So there's another dimension I'd like to talk about, and I don't mean to drone on for very long, but there are two other things that I'd like to mention. One of which is the political economy of welfare use. Now, one of the points that Robert's been making is that it's simply silly to say, okay, we can simply cut off these people and that will solve the problem. Well, one of the reasons that's true, and again, this research is contested, but you have a number of researchers, people like Hilary Hoynes, who claim that access to SNAP is extraordinarily beneficial for children growing up in very poor households. These children might experience cognitive deficits later in life if they do not have access to SNAP. Now, again, we could debate that. Perhaps that's not true. But if it is true, the idea of cutting off very poor individuals, who are, by the way, Americans, they are native-born citizens. They are not people that one can deport. That is something that's very costly indeed that goes to the broader point that Stephen is making in his report. So I think that there's certain naivete around that. And there's also, look at the debate around Obamacare's Medicaid expansion. What you see in state after state, including in Republican states, is that you have hospitals, you have medical providers, you have other political interests that are saying that we want Medicaid expansion. Why? Because Medicaid expansion means revenue for hospitals and medical providers. To say that you're going to have a large universe of people who are going to be excluded from access to basic health benefits, which, by the way, is a huge part of the suite of anti-poverty benefits, just represents a simple confusion, and let's bracket the question of whether or not it's simply indecent. The Oregon Medicaid experiment recently found that for many of the low-income people who gained access to Medicaid, it was worth about 20 cents on the dollar to them. That is, they would have much rather had 25 cents in cash benefits than $1 worth of Medicaid benefits. That tells you that there's a political economy issue here. It's not just immigrants, let's say, who are demanding these programs. It is actually medical providers who are demanding the expansion of Medicaid. And if you want to disempower doctors and nurses and hospitals, you're very welcome to try, but that's profoundly naive. So again, you have to keep in mind that it's actually, or also think about in any inner city community, the number of businesses that depend on SNAP revenue. Do you expect them to just welcome the prospect of the SNAP rolls being slashed in half, or of people going hungry who are already a part of our society, again, including American-born children? That seems profoundly foolish to me. But the other thing I'll mention, and this is a much more contentious subject, but I do think it needs to be raised. We now live in a society in which we have a belief in racial inclusion. We believe that the elite of our society should be broadly representative of the society as a whole. That's one reason why we are profoundly concerned about the fact that, for example, African Americans remain underrepresented in the upper echelons of American life in many different domains. Now, part of the immigration issue is that you have a huge number of people who, again, have very limited skills, and their children are likely to struggle. What this means is that 20, 30 years hence, you're going to have a large number of native-born Americans who are going to observe that people of their origin are sorely underrepresented in the upper echelons of our society. Now, it could be that they will be entirely delighted with that outcome because, of course, they were given access to Medicaid, SNAP, and various other programs as children, and so they're going to feel a deep sense of gratitude, and they will recognize that, of course, it is inevitable that people with, limited levels of literacy and numeracy are, the children of such people are going to have a much harder time. I would argue that for good reason, it might lead them to start questioning the legitimacy of American society, its basic fairness. And I think that you already see this. The Public Religion Research Institute releases a survey of Hispanic values. The last one was released in 2013. And what they found is that first-generation Hispanic immigrants are actually far more confident in the fairness of American society. They are far more likely to believe that America is a society in which people of any background can flourish and achieve upward economic mobility than native-born Hispanics. Now, it could be that immigrants, including recent immigrants, know much more about American society than someone like me who was born in the United States. I'm 35 years old, lived here my whole life, and I'm very keenly, I think that I'm keenly aware of the various ways that society can be really rough for people whose parents don't have a ton of skills, don't have a ton of education. I'm someone who has a deep understanding, or I think that I have a deep understanding of the role that social networks play in achieving upward mobility. There's been a great deal of work by sociologists recently about this idea of racism without racists. And the basic idea is that, look, opportunities are spread through your social networks. And when you're dealing with a society, a US society, in which the level level of educational attainment is much, much higher than it had been 100 years ago. Yet the educational attainment of immigrants is much, much lower. The level of social intermingling between these groups is low. Again, not because of racism, but simply because we have a society in which we have a higher level of sortative mating. People marry people with similar education levels. They become friends with people with similar education levels. We are creating, I fear, a ghettoized minority. And for however much you do to actually make this constituency to give them the resources they need to live a decent and dignified life, it is not going to facilitate the kind of upward mobility that we care about. There are things we might do, but again, those things are labor intensive and far more expensive than anything that we're contemplating right now. So I would ask people on the political left, who again might be disinclined to trust me because of course I'm a conservative, but I think that we share a lot of the same concerns, to think hard about this. If you believe that it is indecent to pay someone less than $12 an hour, let alone $15 an hour, if you think that it's positively indecent to not give poor children, regardless of whether their parents are less skilled immigrants or natives, access to SNAP, to Medicaid, to a suite of other benefits, you need to think very hard about our prospective immigration policies. And finally, if you're someone who cares about the idea of ethnic and racial justice, and who cares about the idea that people who are of any different background feel as though they have a fighting chance to make it not only to the middle class, but perhaps even to the upper echelons of society, you need to really think hard about the ways that we're sowing distrust by not confronting the difficulties that less skilled, low-wage workers in this country face. Thank you.